media.
The butcher's secret. There was something about the smell that made your stomach tighten with hunger the moment you stepped onto the cracked pavement outside Brannigan's butcher shop. It was a scent unlike any other, a thick, almost sweet aroma that wrapped around your senses, curling into your nostrils, burrowing into your brain. It wasn't just the scent of meat. It was something deeper, richer, something that stirred a primal need inside you. Something that made you salivate before you even stepped through the door. Brannigan's had been in town for longer than anyone could remember. The butcher shop sat at the edge of the small downtown strip, wedged between a boarded-up tailor shop and a flower shop that never seemed to have any customers. But Brannigan's always had a line. No matter the day, no matter the weather, people would stand outside, chatting in hushed, eager voices as they waited for their turn to step inside. They came from miles around, drawn in by something unexplainable, something more than word of mouth. People swore by the place. They swore that once you'd eaten Brannigan's meat, nothing else would ever compare. The shop itself was warm and welcoming, the inside a stark contrast to the old and slightly worn exterior. Overhead lights cast a golden glow over the polished white tiles, and the air buzzed with the steady hum of a refrigerator unit in the back. Glass display cases stretched along the walls filled with glistening, perfectly marbled cuts of deep red meat. Thick steaks, plump sausages, ribs so fresh they seemed to quiver slightly. The place was spotless, almost too clean. There were no telltale splatters, no stray gristle or bits of bone, nothing that hinted at the messiness of a butcher's work. It was pristine. Behind the counter stood Brannigan himself. He was a broad-shouldered man with thick, meaty hands and a white apron that always seemed clean despite the nature of his work. His face was round and ruddy, his eyes small and dark beneath bushy eyebrows. He had a way of smiling that never quite reached his eyes, a deep, knowing grin that sent a prickle down your spine. He never had to push his products. People practically begged for them. Todd Fisher had never been one for small-town traditions. He had moved here 3 months ago, looking for an escape from the endless concrete sprawl of this city, trading in his cramped apartment for a small rental house at the edge of town. He wasn't the type to get caught up in local legends. He had rolled his eyes when he first heard the townsfolk gushing about Brannigan's, dismissing it as exaggerated small-town pride. But then he tasted the meat. It was at a cookout hosted by his neighbor, an older man named Gary, who had been more than happy to welcome Todd into the neighborhood. The moment the first bite of sausage hit Todd's tongue, he felt something he couldn't describe. His skin tingled, his mouth flooded with saliva. The taste was impossible to put into words, deep, complex, richer than anything he had ever experienced. His stomach clenched in pleasure, and an overwhelming sense of satisfaction bloomed in his chest. He needed more. By the next morning, Todd was standing in line outside Brannigan's, shifting impatiently from foot to foot as he waited his turn. He spent far more money than he intended to, walking out with a heavy brown paper bag filled with steaks, ribs, sausages. That night, he cooked an entire steak for himself and ate it without pause. He ate until he was full, then kept eating until his stomach ached. And yet, when he finally stopped, he felt something strange, like a hunger that had just begun instead of being sated. Days passed, then weeks. Todd stopped buying meat from the grocery store. Everything else tasted bland, flavorless. Even the high-end cuts from the gourmet butcher in the next town over tasted wrong, as if they were missing some crucial ingredient. His freezer was soon stocked only with cuts from Brannigan's. He stopped going out to eat. He lost interest in the foods he used to love. But Todd was the type of person who always needed to know more, and as his addiction to Brannigan's meat deepened, so did his curiosity. One night, after a late shift at work, Todd was driving home when something caught his eye. The lights in Brannigan's shop were off, the closed sign hanging in the window, but around the back, the dull glow of taillights flickered in the darkness. Slowing his car, he pulled off to the side of the road, watching from a distance. Brannigan's old truck was backed up against the rear entrance. Todd squinted, his stomach turning as he realized where the truck had come from. The building just behind Brannigan's shop wasn't a warehouse. It was the town's nursing home. Todd sat frozen, watching as Brannigan moved to the back of the truck, his large hands gripping something long, wrapped in white sheets. something that sagged in the middle as he lifted it over his shoulder and carried it into the shop. Todd knew what he saw. He knew. But the next morning, when he walked into Brannigan's, the only thing that filled his mind was the smell. That rich, intoxicating scent that wrapped around his brain like a drug, dulling his thoughts, making his stomach growl. Brannigan greeted him with his usual grin, sliding a thick, fresh cut across the counter. "Special cut today," he said, winking. Todd hesitated. His fingers trembled as he picked up the package, feeling the warmth still radiating through the butcher paper. It wasn't possible. It couldn't be. And yet, he took it home. He cooked it. And as he ate, as the juices coated his tongue, the horror of what he had seen melted away beneath the overwhelming pleasure of the taste. He knew, and he didn't care. Days blurred into weeks. Todd stopped leaving town. He stopped answering calls from friends outside the area. Every time he thought about quitting, about leaving, something in his body protested. He would break out in a cold sweat, his stomach twisting violently, his limbs trembling. And then, just when he thought he might collapse, he would walk into Brannigan's, and all the pain would vanish the moment he took a bite. Then one night, as he lay in bed, stomach twisting with hunger despite having eaten an entire steak only an hour before, he heard a noise. A slow, deliberate creak from his front porch, then another, a heavy footstep, a knock, soft, patient. His breath hitched. The knock came again, firmer this time. His phone was dead. He had no way to call for help. And then from the other side of the door, a voice, deep, amused, unmistakable. "Running low, Todd?" He pressed a shaking hand over his mouth, willing himself not to make a sound. A pause. Then the voice again, closer this time, as if leaning against the wood. "I've got something fresh for you. Special cut." Silence stretched thick and suffocating. Then, ever so softly, the door handle turned.